Okay. As Mika mentioned, I think the title probably is not quite correct. So just to give you a bit of background on what I do, because I'm actually a bit of a latent geek as well. I'm a ethical hacker and licensed pen tester, and also an AWS architect and a forensic investigator. The reason I mention that is I will probably come at the discussion around Microsoft workloads with a little bit of a veneer thrown in over that side of it. A bit on SRA. SRA's journey with AWS has been about a 5-year, 6-year journey. We started because we do environmental data management, and we put that on the AWS platform. So we're doing IoT these days, but of course 25 years ago when we started it wasn't IoT. We also run a lot of workloads, including the Microsoft workloads. I also have a background of 10 years in Microsoft, so I haven't got a PhD in Microsoft licensing, but we'll touch on that a little bit later. Okay, the agenda for this afternoon, really I would just like to cover off a few things, and it's not going to be possible to do a detailed discussion about Microsoft workloads and AWS. 25 years ago, if you were in IBM, you wouldn't get fired if your customers were buying IBM typically. I want to try and provide you a bit of a convincing story that actually putting Microsoft on an AWS workload is also not going to get you fired. In fact, there are a hell of a lot of benefits out of doing that. And taking the default, which probably most customers and partners would do, is to turn around and maybe put it on an Azure platform, for instance, as a default position. Just a question: who here are business partners of AWS? Raise your hands so I can get an idea. Yes, 1, 2. Okay, and the rest of you would be customers, or just thinking about maybe joining the AWS family? Okay, good. Well, I've got a bit of a story for all of you, I think. What I'll also cover is how we might look at some of the more common applications, and I regard Office 365 as a bit of an application, so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I'm going to talk about the fundamentals of how you would integrate that environment together, and then rather than going broad and trying to educate you on all of the Microsoft workloads on AWS and how you would do it, I'm just going to pick a couple of common ones. Dynamic CRM and SharePoint, which is some that come up quite a lot in our travels. Okay, and at the end of it, what I've also done is I've provided you a substantial number of resources. So as Mika mentioned, in the presentation, you'll get the slide decks. I hope I've put together a slide deck that will actually give you some information that you can take away and refer to, because there's a wealth of resources available for it. So what's the business reason? Why would you start looking at running Microsoft workloads on AWS as opposed to perhaps running on the Azure platform? Well, I think fundamentally for me, in oftentimes there is a case for having more control over the infrastructure. If you had an on-premise deployed infrastructure, you wanted some level of control over your operations management of that infrastructure, and you want to take care of the version controls and the like. And you were probably integrating some of those applications into other applications. Common ones for, say, SharePoint, for instance, might be, trim. So you want to have some level of control over, the versions. You don't want it changed. So if you are just deploying the Office 365 environment, then Microsoft will give you plenty of warning in terms of when they're likely to be upgrading those versions, but they are controlling that version upgrade. If you have a lot of those systems integrated to other back-end systems or other document management systems, that becomes a little bit of a problem. I think also as a CISO, I like the shared security model of AWS. I also write a lot of policy documents, business continuity plans, incident response plans, and a lot of those standard operating procedures for the management of our infrastructure. I also want to have a reduced blast area, so having some level of control over that is important. But at the same time, I want to provide our staff and our customers the ability to be able to have that seamless, frictionless experience with respect to having access to the respective applications. So being able to write those systems and processes around and use the DevOps infrastructure in place. And Ankush mentioned earlier on today, he was giving you some ideas of how you might use Lambda, for instance, to provide some DevOps management of the security posture of your infrastructure. There's a very good presentation if you want to go back to, I think, last year's reInvent. There were a number of sessions that you can view on YouTube that cover off things like how you would use Lambda to automate some of the system responses to perhaps DDoS attacks and the like, and that's one of the things that, or one of the options that Ankush showed earlier. But there are certainly others around doing backups and a range of other things that you might want to include in the management of your infrastructure. I also care a lot about risk and governance, and once again putting those documents together and actually having infrastructure that is not only compliant and conformant to industry standards, makes having conversations with customers, and also giving yourself a level of satisfaction that that the infrastructure is sound and secure is also important. I think also, and what I've seen over the few years of actually deploying these applications, is the performance of the AWS infrastructure is actually also very good. There is a white paper, and I'll cover Dynamics 365 and Dynamics CRM later on. There is a white paper on deploying Dynamics CRM or Dynamics 365 in the Azure cloud. It's interesting that if you compare the sizing of those compared to some of the sizing that I'm going to show you later on, and having the ability to do auto-scaling and some of those things, there are sweet spots that you can find if you're prepared to sit down and do the cost modeling. That actually means you get, in many cases, better performance out of the AWS infrastructure. And of course, elasticity comes with how we manage that process. Now, I talk a lot about the Office 365 versus the on-premise function. You don't need to read too much detail into this particular session. I just want to show you here that there are things that you can't get access to. If you look at on the left-hand side, we've got SharePoint Enterprise 2016 with some of the functionality there. On the right side of those, we're missing things like access to global administrator. We're missing things like ability to be able to have multiple sites. And those sorts of things. And not surprising, because Office 365 is a fully managed service. So Microsoft need to be able to hold that information near and dear. I guess it wouldn't be a discussion about Microsoft if we didn't include Microsoft licensing. Little known fact is AWS is probably Microsoft's largest hosting provider. And it's quite valid and viable for some of the workloads to be able to utilize the AMIs that already exist with the Microsoft licensing as part of the bundle for that. The other option you've got, of course, is to bring your own licenses, and that has some features. You can, if you are, if you have an enterprise agreement or you have licenses under Active Software Assurance, you have the ability to be able to migrate those licenses to the AWS cloud and to be able to have that same experience. However, there is a limitation on this, and what's that function of AWS that we talk about that provides the level of elasticity and horizontal scaling? What do we call that? EC2 in, have you heard auto-scaling before? What do you think happens with auto-scaling? We need to have a server license for each one of those VMs that we fire up, in theory. Well, this licensing model is one that we embraced quite a while back, service provider licensing agreement. And it's a very, very good licensing agreement for being able to effectively decouple and provide a sort of more, I guess, OpEx-like experience for deploying AWS applications from a licensing standpoint. You pay the money, in the case of a customer, you might pay the money, but you've been already running that infrastructure for a little while. From a business partner point of view, you're probably collecting the money before you actually get charged for it, because there's latency between the billing cycle, so it's not bad from that point of view. It's a monthly subscription base, which means that you can actually increase and decrease the amount of licenses that you have by month. So if you have an increase in user load, that's fine on 1 month. If the next month you need to reduce it, you just go down and you report a lower number. It works well for multi-tenanted environments. So if you're a customer that has a number of subsidiaries and you want to actually keep separate instances of, say, SharePoint or something like that, you can do that very easily with this model. For the academic members of our audience, there is academic licensing under this. What we've effectively done out of using the SPLA model is we've taken effectively about 4,000 individual product licenses and multiple licensing programs and collapsed it into one. We no longer talk about server and CAL, client access licenses, anymore. We talk about SALs, subscriber access license. And that means that basically you just pay for the number of users that are connecting. And it doesn't matter if you auto-scale in the background, because you can have dozens of servers in the background, and they're all effectively licensed, because they're licensed by virtue of the fact that you have a subscriber access license to connect to that infrastructure. That also works best internally as well, because there is a percentage of that licensing agreement that allows for you to use those licenses internally within your own organization. Okay, the other, getting a bit more of the technical description, fundamental to Microsoft, or the deployment of Microsoft applications, is really the identity system, Active Directory. And I just want to show you some of the deployment methodologies for deploying Active Directory, and I'll describe some of these. There are some great white papers that I've listed later on. There's also some CloudFormation templates that actually provide you, very robust multi-AZ infrastructure for Active Directory and some of the other technologies that I'll talk about. The first one on the left-hand side is basically, just a normal internet-connected Active Directory environment. Probably not a lot of use for you. It's probably going to be a little bit more important when you start looking at connecting that infrastructure to maybe an on-premise Active Directory environment. There are a couple of caveats that I really want to point out to you that I stumbled over in the first instance. So if you're going to deploy this, and it's detailed in the documentation, consider describing your Active Directory infrastructure in the sites and services in Active Directory, because you need to look at having the placement of those Active Directory EC2 instances in your on-premise Active Directory, so that the requests from perhaps your office aren't going automatically to the cloud, but they're actually going to the local Active Directory environment from a latency standpoint. So the other one, just in terms of constructing this, consider also DHCP options. So if you're building the Active Directory infrastructure from, or in the cloud from your AD environment that's on premise, you may want to consider, pointing your DHCP options so that it knows about the Active Directory infrastructure in the on-premise environment that it's reading off. And that's, as I said, it's detailed in the white paper. Integration with Office 365. I look at Office 365 as being just another application. I hope I've given you a compelling reason why you would consider looking at perhaps deploying some of those applications, the Dynamics 365, the SharePoint environment, in an on-premise, in AWS environment, but effectively the on-premise deployment, rather than necessarily just using Office 365. Whoops, sorry. I've got two screens here, I'm getting mixed up. So one of the things that we want to do is create that seamless user experience for the users. That seamless user experience is going to be provided by just having a single sign-on environment. So the way we would create this is we would start by creating an AWS Active Directory environment using Active Directory, the fully managed Active Directory environment, or the one that you've created yourself. We would then create an EC2 instance where we'd put the management tools on that, create an Active Directory Federation server, EC2 instance, run Active Directory Sync, Azure Active Directory Sync, to connect basically to Azure AD in Office 365. And in that way, you can basically provide that seamless integration between the two environments. And in fact, from a user standpoint, they won't notice the difference when they're actually hitting the SharePoint environment later on, because they're not actually being prompted for additional credentials and the like. Okay, let's move on to one of the examples, the SharePoint environment. This particular SharePoint environment is the subject of a complete CloudFormation template. It's going to take around about 40 minutes to 3 hours for you to fully populate this, and some of that time is actually going to be copying over the ISO image into an S3 bucket so that you can start to to populate or to run the script. A couple of gotchas here that I'll mention because I fell over it badly in the first instance. You've only got a certain number of elastic IPs that you've got in a standard account unless you ask for more. This is going to consume a few, and I can tell you my CloudFormation template fell over quite a number of times before I finally figured out that it was because I didn't have enough elastic IPs to fire it up. So there's a little bit of pre-work, once again also mentioned in the document. This one is a dual AZ description, and you'll notice how we've actually gone to your multi-tier environment. We're running subnets around each of the particular workloads, and some of that's because we want to not only take advantage of the stateful firewall around the EC2 instance using the security groups, but we also want to consider how you would use network ACLs to actually, at the subnet level, consider the traffic in between the two environments. I also like to use, even if I was not to build a dual AZ environment, I still like to also use elastic load balancing. Even if it's just got one EC2 instance hanging off the side, it provides that level of abstraction from the private subnetted infrastructure. Some of the considerations that I think you should look at when you're deploying this is that the first and fundamental question is: are you running a public-facing environment, or is it going to be over a Amazon Direct Connect or a VPN? Is it going to be a private connected environment? Are you going to run dual AZ or in a high availability environment, or just a single AZ? Obviously there's a big cost attached to that. I think if you're going to run external, you need to be aware that, and particularly if you're using the elastic load balancer, that there's a limitation of the load balancer in terms of the authentication mechanisms that'll go across there. So you need to be looking at forms-based authentication for SharePoint in that environment, because NTLM is not able to be passed over the elastic load balancer at this time. The other one is that you also want to consider the fact that you're going to have to build the SQL environment. It might be SQL always on availability groups, etc. If you've got a high availability environment, and that's because in the same way that Microsoft wouldn't give you access to Office 365 from a global administrator point of view, the managed service of RDS means that they want to hold on to the credentials for the SA and root access. So Dynamics CRM, I think you can probably read most of those fairly easily. There's a couple of things just on that. Obviously, it's a Windows Server environment. You're going to need the Active Directory. Some of the optional areas are, if you want to store documents, you might want to consider using SharePoint for that document management environment. CRM has a lot of reporting function that's actually provided by reporting services in SQL. So you want SQL reporting services. You also want to consider whether your users are going to be connected via Outlook for Mac or Windows, or via the interface. And there are some points there also about whether you're using Microsoft Exchange or whether you use a POP server to provide the email access for for CRM. In terms of the deployments, some of the deployments of CRM that you want to consider is the number of concurrent users you have. Now, I've provided some examples here. This one I would probably typically use for less than 25 users, and it would be usually a UAT environment. It's basically deploying SQL and CRM on the same server. Not optimal. Some of the considerations that you want to have is the number of concurrent users, the number of users that are accessing CRM via devices. There's a different workload on that. Whether you're using high availability. If you're running a telesales environment where they're relying on on CRM, then you probably need to consider perhaps increasing the size of your infrastructure so that you're getting that sub-second performance when they're going through talking to somebody on the phone. This is a two-tier example. The only modification I'd make to this two-tier example is you notice that the SQL and CRM instances, whilst they're separate, they're in the same subnet. My preference typically was to put SQL in a database tier and be able to use network ACLs in between the subnets to control the traffic in there. Then we move into a multi-tier environment. We're adding an elastic load balancer to that infrastructure, and the same controls are there, or the same responsibilities are there in terms of the SharePoint for how you would connect that infrastructure there. And the CRM high availability environment takes that one step further. Notice we're using an elastic load balancer inside. Now, those examples that I provided, this particular example is for potentially up to 800 users or thereabouts. The previous example is probably up to 320 users, or 25 to 320 users, and then you've got the single environment, as I said, UAT or just for very, very small deployments. Okay, that really brings me to pretty well the end. The resources that I've provided for you that you can take away later, there's some great resources available to you in this infrastructure. All of the documents that I've put the links to there, and I've actually included some extra ones around link and exchange, which we didn't have time to to cover in this particular session. Have a look at those. Also, have a look at the dearth of resources that are available in some of the previous reInvent sessions, because there's some great sessions around maintaining security and automating the functions and building that case to really want to run Microsoft applications on AWS. Thank you very much.